Shalom and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this programme today we'll be discussing what are the opportunities and the challenges facing Israel in 2022. Warm welcome to the programme, and today's special guest is a broadcaster. He's been on the Middle East Report before. His name's Jonny Gould, who do a wonderful podcast called The Jewish State. So warm welcome back to the programme.
Always a pleasure, Simon. Nice
Excellent.
to see you. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you as well. So it's the first recording on the Middle East Report for 2022. So can you share with us some of the interesting podcasts and issues that you've been covering over recent weeks?
Simon, it has been a surprising and revelatory last half dozen episodes. First of all, as I try to build the network and build the audience, we achieved our highest ever chart position of number 3 in the news commentary charts in Israel, and more surprisingly, the top 20, number 15 in Saudi Arabia. And that's part of the message of the podcast, to spread the tabernacle of peace throughout the world using our wonderful language of English, which crosses borders like no other. And I've been going off in different directions to try and discuss issues for the Jewish people inside the community, but also around the world. There have been some wonderful guests. Tom Tugendhat came on, who is campaigning for a treason law. The idea that atrocities committed in Britain by British people against all communities should be regarded as treason, because he says, quotes, words should be used as they are meant. And this is in the wake of the terrible David Amess MP murder, of course, Joe Cox, and we think of the Manchester bombing. So he was a wonderful guest. I had an extraordinary athlete on, and she really is extraordinary. She is an ultra-religious woman, a mother of 5. She's 31 years old, and she's the Israel National Marathon Champion. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. And she's 1.5 minutes off qualifying for the Olympic Games. She took up marathon running at 26 because she was, quotes, super out of shape. And her first time surprised her. And now she's an elite athlete, and so elite that Adidas have signed her up for the Impossible is Nothing campaign. I covered the President Herzog visit to the United Kingdom, which was full of very, very interesting angles. He was a messenger, I think, on behalf of the Israeli government to thank Britain, first of all, to recognize Hamas as a terrorist organization and to square that circle that they were not a political group and that they should be regarded, like the rest of Europe, as a terrorist organization. But he also sent a message directly into the shell-like of our Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, to tell Britain and the Allies that what's going on in Iran with the enrichment of uranium, the creation of a nuclear bomb, is getting closer, and that Britain should be on guard, and that we're at the 11th hour with that. And my friend James Marlow, who does Israel Briefing on the podcast, warned us that while Iran was pushing enrichment of uranium, that was creating the possibility of an arms race involving the Saudi Arabians. So there is a double important job for President Joe Biden in Vienna to do the talk. So I've been busy. It's been good.
It sounds like you've been very busy, Jonny. Now, of course, we saw some incredibly dramatic events during 2021. For example, a change of administration in Washington, D.C., with Joe Biden being inaugurated as America's 46th president. And then we also saw in May 2021 that Israel faced 11 days of rockets and missile attacks by Hamas, and including Israeli Arabs as well, rioting inside Israel the first time in 20 years. We saw a change of administration in Israel with the Naftali Bennett, Yair Lapid government, coalition government coming in. We also saw the disastrous US military withdrawal from Afghanistan. So how would you describe really what's happened in 2021 will have a direct impact into the events leading into 2022?
Unfortunately, it's like a new year hasn't happened, because there was a small exchange of rocket and retaliation between Hamas and Islamic Jihad at New Year with Israel. Israel fought back. Luckily, there was no escalation. We prayed that even though that war, that 11-day war in the spring and summer of 2021 served both sides for a period of quiet, that doesn't seem to have happened. And by the calculations of the IDF, there are still at least 6,500 or 7,000 rockets inside Gaza, hidden behind schools, hidden in major areas of population that could be fired at Israel. And I think we all pray for a period of quiet so that an opportunity for the Abraham Accords to prosper can continue. And I think that's the change, that Israel is pushing ahead with its life while the Palestinians refuse to discuss peace unless it involves the destruction of Israel. At least that's the extremist side of matters. Meanwhile, Israel and its new partners in the Gulf and with Jordan, who have been friends since 1994, continues to prosper. We're talking about the Saudi Arabians cooperating under the radar. The incredible idea that Indonesia, with the world's biggest Muslim population, may sign the Abraham Accords this year.
Wow, that would be something.
Wow. I want to bring that to you here first. I'd like to tell you it was announced, but it's not. But that is on the cards. And the Maldives as well is looking at new cooperation. And I tell you what, to do deals with beautiful parts of the world, who can argue with that?
Absolutely, absolutely. So talking about Iran, would you say that the nuclear issue, the Iranians' plans to develop nuclear weapons and also its ballistic weapons program, is the biggest foreign policy challenge facing Israel in 2022?
It is indeed, because the existential threat to Israel is precisely that. And President Herzog said to Boris Johnson in the reception at Downing Street that nothing is off the table. And what that means is retaliation to end the nuclear program. We saw high-profile assassinations of nuclear scientists, of army generals during 2021 involving the Trump administration, and indeed Israel's assassination of Fakhrizadeh, who was the head of Iran's nuclear facility. We're told that the Iranian facility is buried deep underground. For security reasons, it's very difficult to get at. But again, there is an ingenuity about Israel and Mossad which can find these things. But really, the Americans really need to understand that if they don't deal with Iran in a direct fashion, then the Saudi Arabians, who have already bought ballistic missiles off China, are renewing that purchase, buying more of them. They're not nuclear, but it's not just about defense against Iran, who incidentally bombed one of their oil facilities during 2019, right, yeah, which America didn't retaliate to, and nor did the Saudis. So they feel it a weakness to Iran. So the ballistic missiles are a way of trying to equalize their power with Iran, but there's something else, and it's a matter of pride. Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, says that if the Persian Shia have weaponry of that quality, so should the Sunni world's Arab leaders. And so now we're talking about pride as well as security. Hello, Israel's in the middle, and the potential for attack from Iran is existential. So Israel needs to communicate to Joe Biden just how important these talks are with Iran, because actually they may never be enough, as we saw with Obama's JCPOA, which Donald Trump withdrew from. He said it was the worst deal in American history. And this is an attempt for Iran to buy time. The talks are on, they're off, they're on, they're off. There's been a dozen of them. I don't think America is quite as motivated, perhaps, as they should be. This is a threat to world peace.
Absolutely. So let's have a look at this CBN News report talking about the prospect of Israel carrying out potential airstrikes on Iran's nuclear facilities in 2022.
When Israeli Defense Minister Benny Gantz met with U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin recently, he reportedly presented a timeline for an attack on Iran's nuclear program, telling Lloyd Israel is preparing for the Iranian challenge at the operational level. In an article called Just One Wrong Move, the state-affiliated Tehran Times boasted that Iran can hit Israel anywhere. To drive home the point, the story included a map showing selected targets. In this equation, a big question sticks out. How do these foes view the U.S.?
I think the picture is clear that the Iranians see that the United States they don't have to fear the United States, and they're continuing to escalate their program. And in return for the escalation, all they get is more and more concessions to the administration.
National security expert Michael McCoskey has recently talked with a number of Israeli military leaders.
They feel they're alone. They know they're alone. They see a U.S. that is withdrawing from the region, retreating, afraid of confrontation, desperate for a deal, not able to instill fear in the Iranians. And they feel the responsibility is going to be on them, the Israeli military, to prevent a nuclear Iran.
Makovsky says these Israeli military leaders perceive a growing weakness. They cite the Afghan pullout, U.S. reluctance to stand up against Iranian provocations, and an eagerness to enter into a flawed nuclear deal. In the meantime, the IDF needs the U.S. to speed up help in the form of military tools to take on Iran, like KC-46 air tank refuelers.
That's not the only thing Israel needs, by the way. They also need precision-guided munitions. They need more F-35s, F-15Is, some helicopters, things like that. I would not only accelerate delivery to Israel of this, I would make a show of it. It would be a signal to the Iranians.
While the Pentagon is moving slowly in that help, Israelis seem prepared for what might be coming. According to a recent poll, over half of Israelis would favor a military strike against Iran, even without U.S. help.
If I was the Prime Minister, I wouldn't wait for the United States. I would take some definitive action now. I don't know if I would bomb right away, but I think as an option B, I think that's probably what I would do. If somebody walks up to you and says, I'm going to kill you and I'm going to kill your whole family, would you wait for that to happen, or would you take some definitive action to prevent it?
Due to the situation in Iran, they can't have a nuclear weapon. Now, we don't care that India have nuclear weapons or Afghanistan, but Iran is a different thing. It's ideology of destroying the Jewish country. And the last time somebody had this ideology, he killed almost all of the Jewish people.
But I don't think the IDF leadership harbors any illusions that the United States will take care of this problem. I do believe when it comes down to it, they're going to have no choice. I think the U.S. policy has been only to bring us closer to war. I believe the chances are more likely than not that the Israelis will do something militarily to prevent a nuclear Iran. I just think they know they cannot live with a nuclear Iran. The question is what is their red line?
Excellent report put together there by Chris Mitchell from CBN. Jonny, this is the kind of big question, I think, of 2022, and this is certainly something that's been looming for the last couple of decades. Will Israel carry out airstrikes against Iran's nuclear facilities? Because under President Trump, it would look like Israel had that backing from the United States, but with Biden's reluctancy to engage in any kind of foreign wars whatsoever, even if it's to defend the Middle East and defend Europe and even defend American sovereignty, I don't think he has the stomach for it. So it means Israel would have to go alone.
Yes, it is true that America is showing the Middle East that they are gently withdrawing their influence from the military side of the nations. And what we've seen is Israel being thrown out of the crib, if you like, faced up to a multipolar world where they have to be strong for themselves. I spoke to Ambassador Michael Oren about 4 or 5 episodes ago, who talked about the $3.8 billion per year of aid which comes from the United States to Israel. And he said that with Israel's GDP now greater than Italy's and Japan's, the message that America used to give with this $3.8 billion was that they were a superpower behind the Jewish state. But with them withdrawing from the world as they have, that message is not as clear. And so Michael Oren, in his, let's say, forthright way of talking in American English, he said, because there are so many strings attached to that amount of money coming to Israel, in other words, you can't buy everything you want with the money, it always has to go to American businesses. And of course, senators and congressmen and women like the amount of jobs that it engenders. It's a kind of, if you like, an aid to the country's economy. He says that if it's not viewed as strong as it used to be, then he said they should keep their aid. And that's a very big statement. And when I asked him about keeping their aid, that's a huge amount of money, and America is still a very important ally. He reminded us that in 1967, the Six-Day War was fought without a single American bullet. So these are very, very difficult questions. But one thing's for sure, the isolationist American style of the Joe Biden administration looks to continue. Israel is probably on its own, and that trip through the marketplace there in Tel Aviv, probably, or Jerusalem, probably tells you everything you need to know about Israeli public opinion about striking Iran.
Absolutely. And also linked to this issue would be the repercussions, because if Israel decided to carry out airstrikes, and I think they could probably push back the Iranian nuclear program certainly by 10 or 15 years through military action alone. I mean, we have seen explosions at Natanz nuclear facilities. We have seen attacks on other nuclear plants within inside Iran, but this would be a kind of direct offensive against the Iranian regime. There are no doubt that the Iranians would use their terror proxies such as Hezbollah and Hamas, or even the Palestinian Authority then, to carry out another uprising or another intifada together with rockets and missiles. So, and also we'd see the explosion of anti-Semitism on a scale that we've never even seen before. So we know that this is a difficult decision for any Israeli government to make. We even question whether this coalition government could survive such a decision, but Israel, faced with such evil, would have no other choice. But how do you think Hamas and Hezbollah would react? Would we see thousands and thousands of rockets from the south and the north targeting Israeli civilian centres?
Yes, they are Iran's proxies and Qatar's as well. This is deeply problematic for Israel, and I know that many hawks within the Israeli political climate would say that rather than playing the Iranian game of attacking back to the proxies, that actually Iran should face the ire of Israel directly. Again, I'm going to quote Michael Oren from the podcast, which says something like, not an eye for an eye, we'll take the whole face. He believes in confronting Iran and its oil fields and producing grievous damage. I hate as a man of peace to talk in ways of war like this, but Israel's defense is absolutely key, and we are getting to a point where fighting proxy wars when Israel is not that big, not that wide geographically, it has to defend itself, and maybe the time has come to do that. Time will tell. We have a very strong Prime Minister in Naftali Bennett. We appear to have a strongish coalition government of the most extreme rainbow of people, from the ultra-Orthodox religious Jews to Islamists on the left. We saw a surreal moment where the deputy Knesset speaker was talking to a member of the Israeli government who was an Islamist. They were talking for 15 minutes in the Knesset in Arabic. Now, I'm not sure whether that's allowed or not, whether the whole of the language should be in Hebrew, but that was going on. I mean, it is an issue of extreme self-confidence in the Jewish state that they can allow this discussion, but it went on. But that is the state of things. But I don't think anything will get in the way of Israel being strong in the face of existential threat like this.
And Johnny, we've seen over the last couple of years a new tactic being deployed by the Palestinian Authority, and that is to engage Israel in military conflict so that Israel can be taken to the International Criminal Court or under investigation by the UN's Human Rights Council for alleged war crimes or crimes against humanity, where they know that they have the support of the ICC as well as the UN to erode Israel's ability to defend itself. And we're seeing some high-profile investigations already being carried out by the UN against Israel. Do you think that this is what they want to do, is to provoke Israel into another war like we saw in May of 2021?
I think Israel knows that it is about provocation. And so they have to take these small windows of opportunity to exact structural damage to the opposition. And that's the message that, for me, came out of the 11 days, that there were stored up strategies on the Israeli side to try to deal with Islamic Jihad and Hamas. 4,000 rockets were expended upon Israel. I mean, the tragedy of it was that Arabs were killed on both sides of the border. Their own Gazans were killed. Arabs inside Israel were killed. Thai workers in a field were killed. An Indian carer lady for an elderly Jewish lady was killed. I mean, it's just indiscriminate. It's the worst possible war crime that could be committed. And 4,000 rockets were expended. We believe that there are 7,000 still left there. You know, let's just hope that some sort of impasse can be created. That's, I think, the best we can hope for in 2022.
So let's look at this other CBN news item that's entitled "Experts Warn Another War Between Israel and Gaza Could Be Coming Soon."
The Israel Defense Forces said it struck rocket manufacturing sites and Hamas military targets in Gaza. The strikes mark only the second incident between Hamas and Israel since a ceasefire ended an 11-day war last May. One expert examined that conflict and tells CBN News what you heard about the causes may not be so accurate. During that war, Hamas fired more than 3,000 rockets into Israel. Israel's Iron Dome shot down about 90% of those rockets, while the IDF responded with surgical strikes against the terror group's military infrastructure inside Gaza. Jonathan Schanzer writes in his new book, Gaza Conflict 2021, that much of the media covering the war got it wrong.
A lot of people talk about fake news. I'm not sure that applies here. I'm not even sure that the word bias applies here. The problem was, it was almost as if the West and the Middle Eastern media, and I would actually say that includes Israeli media as well as Arabic media, it seemed like they were covering two different wars entirely.
The majority of those reports stated the war began over disturbances on the Temple Mount and a real estate dispute in a Jerusalem neighborhood.
That was all over the Western press, but yet people just decided to ignore the fact that Palestinian elections were canceled and that Hamas was angry and looking to make a splash, and that's exactly what they did by launching the war. People forget, you know, they talk about how angry they are at Israel when it responds to these rockets, which, by the way, I mean, these are provocations by Hamas. Israel's responses are almost entirely defensive in nature.
Schanzer says much of the media also failed to mention Hamas's covenant to destroy Israel, their violent beliefs, and main funding source, Iran.
How much it has invested financially in Hamas, how much has it invested in the rockets, in the mortars, in the tunnels, in all of the weaponry that we saw used during this conflict. I mean, people sort of guess or think that somehow Hamas builds up this arsenal organically. That is not what happens. They get it from specific sources, and it usually tracks back to the Islamic Republic in Tehran.
Given the mainstream media support for creating a Palestinian state, many news outlets fail to recognize that Hamas is a tyrannical organization dominating the people of Gaza.
They have no freedom. And meanwhile, Hamas continues to divert all of the building materials and other resources that come in for the benefit of the people of Gaza. They divert that toward the war machine. So they say that they're fighting on behalf of the Palestinian cause, but meanwhile leave 2 million people in utter misery, subjecting them to the whims of the Hamas leadership, who periodically decide to fight Israel with almost certain knowledge that they're going to lose the war, but they wage it for public relations gains.
Schanzer says recent terror attacks inside Israel, inspired by Hamas, signal an attempt to push Israel into another military conflict, a war Schanzer believes might not be too far away.
When you talk to Israeli officials, they'll tell you that Gaza is still on a knife's edge. Hamas always has the ability to take things from calm to war in a very rapid fashion. That is the concern. Hamas knows exactly what buttons to push, whether it's attacks against civilians, whether it's rockets on Jerusalem or rockets on Israel's very populated Mediterranean coast, the center waistline of Israel, as they call it. These are things that Hamas knows if they want to spark a war, they can. So the question is, how much longer will calm hold?
Excellent report put together there by CBN. Johnny, we know that 2022 is a very kind of complicated year in terms of Israel's alliances around the world, but also the fact that Israel could face further investigation by the United Nations Human Rights Council that have unprecedented powers now prior to any other agency, and they have a whole agency set up to look into Israel's alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity, when all Israel's doing is defending ourselves from Hamas's rockets and missiles and terror attacks. And yet the UN refused to look into Hamas, who are sponsored by the Iranian regime, as a genocidal terrorist organization, refused to look at the human rights abuses committed by Hamas against their own people in Gaza, and how we'd all like to see Gaza free of occupation and occupation from Hamas.
The UN Human Rights Council needs a substantial reform. Some of the countries that are involved in the Human Rights Council bring it into disrepute. We are a very, very long way from the term human rights being meaningful. They invest so much time and energy in the Jewish state when there are so many other injustices around the world. As Tom Tugendhat put it on a parallel issue, when the world goes on about Israel, when the world talks about so-called apartheid and other such alleged false allegations and crimes and libels and slurs, they diminish real problems among other communities around the world. I'm just thinking off the top of my head about the Uyghur Muslims in China, and I'm thinking about the Yazidi people of northern Iraq, many of whom still live there, but a diaspora has emerged in Germany in some of the major cities. So I think that the UN Human Rights Council is an absolute tragedy for oppressed people around the rest of the world.
Absolutely. But when it comes to the new Israeli government, and many political analysts are actually surprised that it's actually been able to stay in power for this long. So the big question is, can the government of Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid survive in 2022, or are we going to see a comeback from Benjamin Netanyahu, who was Israel's longest serving prime minister?
Well, it seems to be holding together because they are really united around only one thing. Ideological bedfellows these guys are not, from the ultra-religious on the right to the Islamic extremists on the left. Not sure whether they big up destruction of Israel when they are members of Israeli society.
Muslim Brotherhood supporters, so very much aligned to Hamas.
Yes.
And the Qataris.
It's an extraordinary government. If you want to know where democracy sits, it sits in the Knesset. But one thing they are unified on is keeping Benjamin Netanyahu out of power. And if there was another expensive election tomorrow, again, it looks like Benjamin Netanyahu would win the popular vote. But Israeli politics doesn't work like that. There was, again, in the last election, a loggerhead. He couldn't raise the government that he needed and wanted. And so, of course, it was left to Naftali Bennett, who then came up with a horse trading deal where at some point, if the government survives long enough, Yair Lapid will be Prime Minister. I mean, that is a very, very long way away. But so far, you know, the budget was passed. And of course, we know that in Israel, if the budget isn't passed, then we're into another election, which is why we had so many elections. The budget's never got passed. So finally, the budget got passed. And again, it's all about the new leader of the opposition, Benjamin Netanyahu, and keeping him out of power. He's in court again at the moment and into the following weeks because of a libel suit he's got against another former Prime Minister, Ehud Olmert. So, you know, he's busy. He's busy as the leader of the opposition, but he's still probably the most popular politician out there in terms of popular vote, if not universal love.
And maybe the most politically savvy of all.
Without doubt. So the most experienced and probably the most famous Israeli politician around the world.
Absolutely. So also when it comes to America's historic relationship, and it was David Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister, who understood that the only way Israel was to survive is she had the backing of a superpower. At the time of the Cold War, it was a choice between the Soviets or the United States of America. And of course, in his foresight, he gravitated Israeli foreign policy towards the United States. And we know that that relationship has gone up and down over the years. But with President Biden now in power, now coming up for almost his first anniversary in power, even though it feels so much longer than that, big questions arise over how strong and united are the US-Israeli alliance.
If I was to headline the first 74 years of the Israeli-American relationship, it really is special because it's not just an ideological one, it's a spiritual one, and it's one that doesn't really exist in any other country of the world. You know, more people go to church in the United States per capita than any other nation. There is a kinship, there is a view amongst the American forefathers of the 17th and 18th century that they were leading people into their promised land. That even some of the traditional Jews who've lived in the United States for 2 and 3 centuries believe that they're not the diaspora, believe that they are in the promised land in the United States, that there are 2 promised lands, the one in the United States and the one in Israel. Sadly, I think that America is changing. It started to happen in the Barack Obama era, and this has forced Israel out of the crib, out of the nursery in America, and to look for a slightly more multipolar relationship. And of course, this has coincided with Israel becoming a stronger, should we say, Premier League nation in terms of GDP and in invention, and actually being useful to the world to solve their problems in terms of trade. So I think, sadly, because I think the relationship between Israel and America has been a very beautiful one, I think it's beginning to decline. And how ironic that here we are sitting in the United Kingdom, where we are entering what was recently quoted in the Daily Telegraph by Jake Wallace-Simons, who's the new editor of the Jewish Chronicle as well, a golden era of relations between the UK and Israel. Who'd have thought it?
Absolutely. So do you want to unpack why Israel and the United Kingdom are developing such strong ties? And is it primarily because the UK is no longer under the shackles of the EU and have more freedom then to carry out trade deals with other nations, and finding that Israel with a startup nation and innovation is something that Britain really needs if Britain is to succeed in this 21st century? Indeed,
Simon. I mean, Britain is looking at a foreign policy to look very different from that of its European Union neighbours. And it's a fact that a memorandum of understanding was signed between Britain and Israel in the days and weeks before the EU deal, before it could actually be properly ratified. So Israel was there at the beginning to exchange a new trade deal, which is then being ratified to being a more formal one. and that trade is growing. I think there's also a new ideological understanding with some of the leading lights in Boris Johnson's government and Israel. So again, it's not spiritual in the same way that America is, but there's a sort of intellectual understanding. And I'm talking about people like Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, Liz Truss, Foreign Secretary, and they are very much together for the first time. The idea that Hamas couldn't be outlawed before was that the Foreign Office and the Home Office weren't united in that, and now they very much are. And I mentioned Tom Tugendhat earlier on in our conversation as well, who's very much pro-Israel. So, you know, there's a new reinvigorated idea that Britain needs, post-Brexit, to be something else. They're looking at Israel, which looks very much like a Brexit country, you know, out there as an independent nation, innovative in a way that Britain is as well, with a population which is significantly bigger. I think they see themselves as quite similar, which, when you consider the history of Britain and Israel, Neil Wiggin, the ambassador, Her Majesty's ambassador in Tel Aviv, said that he went down to Ovda, which is the Eilat-based military air base in the south of the country, and he saw that there were 6 RAF fighters down there, and he said that's the most amount of British fighter planes there have been since Israeli independence in 1948. So
that's a great
there's a whole lot of love going on.
And we've got a video to show you on that one. It's the last one on my list. It's called Pilots Explain International Blue Flag Exercise, and this is produced by the IDF.
אנחנו נמצאים היום בתרגיל הגדול ביותר והמתקדם ביותר הבינלאומי שהיה אי פעם בישראל, ואנחנו בעבודה משותפת, גם עבודת תכנון משמעותית מאוד וגם תוך כדי התרגיל מצליחים ללמוד, מצליחים ללמד ולהתקדם יחד עם השותפים שלנו מהמדינות השונות.
We are proud to deliver an advanced exercise, an excellent training and a great opportunity to fly together, side by side, wing by wing, with the best air forces in the world in order to improve everyone's level and capabilities.
Flying with the Israeli pilots showed us that the Israeli Air Force really is a very operational one. The scenarios that we are just experiencing are scenarios that many pilots have flown, so the experience that the pilots have are very valuable for us. Also, the different approach to solve certain problems is very interesting for us to get in the exchange.
So our normal day-to-day training doesn't allow us to really integrate with as many of our allies as would be ideal. So coming out here and getting to do this blue flag exercises allow us to see how our different forces interact and what our strengths and weaknesses are. And that allows us to develop plans and tactics together to maximize the use of our strengths and minimize those weaknesses.
And that video was courtesy of the IDF, and that joint military operation took place last autumn. I think it's extraordinary, the fact that the RAF took part and flew in Israeli airspace for the first time really since prior to the State of Israel, and we're looking prior to 1948, is absolutely incredible. But also the fact that a couple of years earlier that the Israeli Air Force took part in operations in the UK and flew with the RAF for the first time as well. And I think prior to Brexit, or prior to this era, Israel's and Britain's military alliance, its cooperation on intelligence and security was very much, okay, it's going on, it's very close, but let's not draw any attention to it. But it seems very much under Boris Johnson's leadership, and in 2020 and 2021, this has come to the fore.
It's amazing. And when you think about the extraordinary changes there have been, Brexit being one of them, and of course, there was a massive decision that the British people made 2 weeks before Christmas in 2019, and the world would have looked significantly different if Jeremy Corbyn had been Prime Minister.
Absolutely.
So we have been literally on a knife edge. As it was, the election wasn't that close. Boris Johnson won by over 80 seats. But when you think of that existential reality of something else, something very, very different, you've got to say what a great country Britain is. I remember tweeting at the moment where the election was won, just a little Union Jack emoji, because it was a moment of fright for the Jewish community in this country. And to know that the British people, in their millions, were still the same British people that I had grown up with, was a great sense of relief and indeed joy.
Absolutely. Now also last year you had the pleasure of meeting Israel's new president, Isaac Herzog, with his incredible British and Irish heritage.
Yes.
What was that like, and what is he like as a man, and what do you think he will offer Israel going forward as Israel's new president?
You know, we were in the same room as him at two different events, weren't we, Simon? And he fills the room with a command, a gentleness, a likability. It's not just who he represents, but what he is. And you can see that. And as you say, tremendous British and Irish heritage. His family lived in the UK and Ireland for 120 years. His grandparents and great-grandparents, they were leaders, rabbis, in communities, I think, in Leeds and Glasgow and Dublin and London. And of course, there's not exactly a sort of blue blood idea amongst Israeli society. However, he is the first father to follow his, the first son to follow his father as president of Israel. I don't know what pressure that puts on his three sons to become president or to be hugely ambitious. But he told a lovely joke when his father, Chaim Herzog, the former president of Israel, went to Buckingham Palace to see the Queen. They were sat together. The Queen leans over to Chaim Herzog and says, you know, we can trace our lineage all the way back to King David. And Chaim Herzog raised his eyebrow at that, and Isaac Herzog said that, you know, with no hint of ego, we can also trace our heritage back to King David. So Chaim Herzog says to the Queen, in which case, Your Majesty, welcome to the family.
That's excellent. And I just want to give you a quote. This is from the article that you mentioned on the golden era of Anglo-Israeli relations. It says, in recent weeks, London has warmly received official visits from the Israeli President, Isaac Herzog, the Foreign Minister, Yair Lapid, the Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett. These trips have been supported by substantial policy announcements. In November, Foreign Secretary Liz Truss signed a wide-ranging memorandum of understanding with Lapid, enhancing cooperation in the realms of cyber, tech, trade and defence. Several joint military exercises taken place over the last couple of years, and we're seeing really the development of a strong alliance between Israel and Britain on the world stage. So the big question is, how can Britain and Israel use their strength and their influence, which is the foundation of our Western civilization, our Judeo-Christian heritage, to make a big difference and a force for good in the world?
Yes, I think it's a tremendous upside. And, you know, for those viewers who did support Brexit, this is vindication of the vote. For those people who voted Remain who are watching, this is a new Britain. You know, let's go with it. These are the advantages. There are some economic difficulties. There are bumps in the road. And by the way, supply issues are existing right across the world. It's not just about Brexit. There are problems with supply in the United States and in continental Europe as well. But I think it's important that foreign policy amongst independent nations can be distinct and different. And I think we were in shackles when we were in the European Union not to have a substantial foreign policy enough. It got to a point where there was even cooperation between the French and Royal Air Forces, but it wasn't articulate enough. I mean, it seemed to me that within the European Union they were trying to sort of merge a kind of European army, but again the two forces were separate. It wasn't articulate enough in the same way as the cooperation we've seen between Israeli and Britain. There's no merger between Britain and Israel, but they are allies and they're growing allies, and that is understood. So I think we should present to our viewers a moment of optimism about this new higher level cooperation between our countries.
Absolutely. And also, where do you think the Jewish community is in Britain in 2022? As you said earlier, back in December of 2019, we had that general election, and we know that Jeremy Corbyn only narrowly failed to beat Theresa May in that awful election. And of course, the issue of Jeremy Corbyn, anti-Semitism, his hatred of Israel, was mentioned at most Shabbat meals every Shabbat. And knowing that election really ended his chance of becoming Prime Minister, I would pray that is the case and remains the case, even if he forms his own party. But where would you say the Jewish community is in 2022, considering we're seeing this rise of anti-Semitism absolutely everywhere?
It's not easy. We saw in the Gaza War a terrible increase in attacks, both physical and mental, upon the Jewish community. We remember the Blackburn Four who raced down Finchley Road in North London with a megaphone hectoring the Jewish people and non-Jewish people inside their flats, shouting the worst kind of abominations about murder and rape, really terrible things, and they appeared in court. We saw superstars of acting and football tweeting against Israel and in favor of the Palestinians, not necessarily understanding the full consequences of the things they were saying. And more recently, we have seen the BBC attacking Jews in all sorts of ways. There was a debate about to take part, making anti-Zionism a legitimate form of argument. Now, you can be against Israel on a policy basis, but to advocate for the destruction of the Jewish state is quite another matter, and that debate was pulled. I don't think even the most level-headed person would agree that anti-Zionism has a place in common discourse. You can be a critic of Israel but not advocate for its destruction. And of course, last but not least, a major row is going on between the Jewish community and the BBC over the reporting of what we should call the Hanukkah bus in Oxford Street, which was essentially a celebration of Hanukkah, where very loud, noisy guys were shouting at the bus because they were celebrating Hanukkah in a nice and important way. They got out the bus and danced, and they were throwing shoes at the bus. They were chasing the bus down the road, and they even started to sieg Heil at the Jews on the bus. It was organized by the Orthodox Jewish group Chabad, and the BBC London reported it both on their website and in their television report that the men outside were aggravated by anti-Muslim slurs coming from the bus, and it has been shown expressly that really was a leap of intelligence. Those things were never said, and for the BBC not to apologise, to not let the bad air out of the BBC, to open up a window and apologise and say, fair play, we got that wrong, that was shoddy journalism, I think is an absolute disgrace. And to try and hold out and not apologise, where does it leave minority communities of any stripe, Jewish or non-Jewish, anyone, in trust with the BBC? It's a licence-paying fee service. We are compulsorily obliged to pay this, and if we're compulsorily obliged to pay this, there has to be an element of trust. And at the moment, if the BBC don't acknowledge it or apologise, then the relationship with the Jewish community breaks.
Isn't this a kind of new level before? Because before, the Jewish community in this country have been very sickened by the coverage of the BBC to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, never putting in conflict, always almost giving the impression that it's always Israel's fault and that Israel deserves what she deserves. But to come out and then singularly attack the Jewish community is something completely different, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
And does this mark a kind of downward trend of standards and reporting within the BBC that is now undermining kind of the Jewish support in this country through its broadcasting.
Yeah, there is an argument which says that if you report Israel in such a slanderous way over 20 or 30 years, this is the byproduct of it. Anti-Semitism then spills out of anti-Israel reporting, and it happens over and over again. One-eyed analysis of situations occur, and then the echo chamber goes out into the mainstream and then continues to support these libels. And it's come to a point where the BBC are victim blaming these kids. And I saw one or two videos. I mean, Hanukkah is hijinks. It's about dressing up and dancing in circles in an Israeli fashion, having a sing-song.
Eating donuts.
Eating loads of donuts, yeah. Takes a few months to get over them. And not that they're not nice. Bit too much sugar, but you know, these are really serious issues, and it's come to a head. And you know, the BBC cannot hold out. They want to hold out because I suppose they think that if they apologise to that bunch, they'll have to apologise to all bunches everywhere. Well, why don't you show a little bit of humility here?
Absolutely.
You know, this is a really, really important issue. It's not trivial, and it's about trust. And I think broadcasting is only about trust. You've got to relate to your audience. And by the way, that's what you guys do at Revelation TV, probably more than most, I must say.
Thank you. And Jonny, in terms of the Christian community and Christian support for Israel and the British Jewish community, what role can they play in 2022, knowing that, who knows, I think we explored some of the possibilities that Israel could face in 2022, and we pray she doesn't. But if she does, and Israel takes out Iran's nuclear facilities, then that Christian support for Israel and the Jewish community here in the UK is even more vital, isn't it?
I think so, and I applaud Christian members of our society for standing up for Israel, because it's not easy, and you get walloped by perhaps friends and associates and acquaintances for doing so. But all I'd say is that if you believe in something and you believe in your Christianity, stand by your Christianity, stand by your beds, and be proud of who you are. I'm proud of myself as a Jewish person, and that's one thing that many of us have in the. We have a lot of history to carry around with us, but also we have present faith and ideas. And so, on a personal level, I thank you, Simon, for your out there support of the Jewish people and Israelis living in this country, and more than that, standing by your values. Never standing down from what you believe, which I think is really the backbone of whatever anyone does believe in. You have to be who you are.
Absolutely. Well, the one thing that's so special about this programme is having that editorial freedom. And I know that so many other journalists don't have that editorial freedom at all. They're told to toe a line, they're told to toe this storyline. So for me, it's an absolute pleasure to fight for Israel and to fight for the Jewish community as well, to actually report on issues that the mainstream media are refusing to report on. So
I'm sure you have a surprising amount of viewers from beyond the Christian community as well for your free speech as well.
Possibly so as well. Anyway, Jonny, thank you so much for being my special guest.
Always a pleasure.
To discuss the issues facing Israel and the Jewish community in 2022. And I just want to thank you for watching this programme from home. There is no doubt that 2022 will be a very challenging and difficult year, but full of opportunities as well for Israel. So let's continue to pray, let's continue to stand, and let's continue to support Israel and the Jewish people in 2022, because it's imperative that we do so, because our Bible commands that we do so, and that commands a blessing. So I just want to thank you for watching today's Middle East Report.